Roald Dahl, Esio, Trot. Part 2. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hobby to make tortoise sweat with Alfie. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hobby went out onto his balcony, armed with his long metal pole tortoise catcher. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hey, Alfie," Mr. Hobby said. "About to go for a little ride, wiggled the tortoise catcher to us right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the two claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like two fingers or a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Mrs. Hobby weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Holding Alfie in one hand, picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same color shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. But what if he had a lot of tortoises and he sweat a lot, and the tortoises must be 97 ounces? Yeah, what will happen? But it will not happen any time in this book. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hobby's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mr. Silver wouldn't notice it. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mrs. Hobby to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2, alternate Alfie. Mr. Hobby took alternate Alfie, which is tortoise number 2, out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it to Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce. But will it happen? Because if you swap a turtle, the eating things and timing schedule would not be the same. Tortoise number 2, alternate Alfie, had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. Devil, a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out. "Mommy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hobby, peering over his railing, but while in between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, do you seem hungry today? Mrs. Silver was saying. It must be Mr. Hobby's magic words I've been whispering to you. Mr. Hobby watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hobby's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper. Esio trots, Esio trots. Ragged, ragged. You must know, Esio trots. Word poo, fuck poo, tooth poo, derps poo, whoops poo, loose poo. A rock, out fuzz, plug. Top no tough, Esio trots. Top no tough. Techno. I'll walk doof. Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How's Alfie tonight? Oh, he's lovely, Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words. You never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly. You never know. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found the 17-ounce tortoise. And once again, he made sure the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. She will have guessed by now. Mr. Hobby's secret was a very simple one, and the creature grows slowly enough. Very, very slowly indeed. Then you never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. Same with children. They're actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Sabi told himself. So hurried. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, it was Alfie, weight 13 ounces, and the first week, it was alternate Alfie, weight 15 ounces, and the second week, it was alternate tortoise number 2, weight 17 ounces, and of third week, it was alternate tortoise, weight 19 ounces, and the fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighs 21 ounces. The end of the week is number 6, weighing 23 ounces. 6th week, number 7, 25 ounces. The last 7 week, 8, 27 ounces, which is a lot more, 40 more. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks. Mrs. Silverback had more than doubled in size, and a good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty, very big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, You know, Mr. Hobby, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think? Can't see a lot of difference myself, Mr. Hobby had answered casually. Well, Madame, perhaps it was time to call a halt. And that evening, Mr. Hobby was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie, when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. Oh, look! Mrs. Silver was shouting. Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously. Weigh him, Mr. Hobby ordered. Take him in and weigh him quick. So it must be scary that Mrs. Silver needs to buy a new house. That's so fast. It's just 2 months. Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hobby? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big and as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy. Just to look what clever Mr. Hobby had done for you." Mr. Hobby suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to a balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Well, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once," accidentally said Mrs. Selfie. Mr. Hobby rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together, they went out onto the balcony. "Look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hobby said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man, you are indeed." "What am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "Must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." But there was standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, which is tortoise number 8, not Alfie, who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. Will she use a saw and cut the door?" "No, don't do that," Mr. Hobby said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a little tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver said. "So, Mr. Hobby exchange it to smaller, like just number 7. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then Alfie. Let's see." "That's simple," Mr. Hobby said. "Change the dramatic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller, but in tortoise language, of course." "Will that work?" "Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hobby." Mr. Hobby got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, "Esio Trot, Esio trots, take a tip redums." So it's smaller bits, like tortoise, please grow smaller. "They'll do it, Miss Silver," he said, handling her the paper. "I don't mind trying it," Miss Silver said. "But look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hobby." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hobby said. "See it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive." Chapter 4. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hobby lifted the tortoise up from the balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do was now to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. But when he reached Alfie, Alfie forgets Mrs. Silver, or their relationship continues. He chose one and lowered it down with a tortoise catcher. Then, still grappling the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hobby was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver shouts from below, shrill with excitement. "Mr. Hobby! Mr. Hobby! Where are you?" she was shouting. "Just look at this!" Mr. Hobby popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hobby, it worked!" she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his own house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hobby shouted back. "Well, come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hobby turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open the front door and flew down the stairs 2 at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "'Tis it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't push it. I mustn't push it. I must keep very, very calm in peace of silence. Reached there." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once. And let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mr. Silver's parlor, sipping his tea, Mr. Hobby was all of Twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at him. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please will you marry me?" "Why, Miss Hobby," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hobby got rid of his teacup, and the 2 of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hobby said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hobby took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned out his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise to prevent that Mrs. Silver noticed. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mr. Hobby, and the 2 of them lived very happily ever after. P.S. I expect you were wondering what happened to little Alfie versus the moon, who was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Swift, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still a much-loved family pet. And Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him, but he made it in the less